We do have some at the market stall right here at the front of the temple that we priests have personally checked, and they're fine, and they're a little expensive, but we can make sure that this is an acceptable offering since you've come all this way. So you can imagine that that really garnered some pretty negative feelings, and the Sadducees were responsible for that kind of thing. It's really hard for me to be as fair to them as I am to the Pharisees because there's not as much there that's really good to say. And certainly people in the first century tended to have a pretty negative view of this group as well. Another important early group, and since we're talking about the Sadducees, we really begin to discuss the politicization of the Jewish religion. To them, it wasn't like you have church and state, and the two things are separate. It's really more that you express your religion within your civic life. The Sadducees said, this life is what there is. Let's be big boys about this, and let's just do what we have to do to get on with the Romans and yet maintain some distinctiveness in our identity. Not everybody was satisfied with that answer. One group had a different answer. That was the Zealots. And the Zealots become an increasingly important group in the mid-1st century AD, or CE, however you want to date that. The Zealots were really a group of radicals who really anticipated the coming of God's kingdom in the Messianic age, and that God was going to set them free again, was going to fix them and step in to improve their social, their economic, and their political condition by reestablishing a free kingdom of Israel, which they understood as God's people and his political kingdom on earth. Whereas some groups were content to wait and to pray and to hope that God would bring these things about, they weren't. They decided to take pretty drastic measures. Some of these folks in the Zealots were Sicarii. They were knife men, so they would find Roman sympathizers or officials at vulnerable moments, like in the marketplace or going in and out of synagogue, and they would knife them. And they would do this with the hope that they could, through violence and through a political and military revolution, bring about a positive change of God's kingdom coming on earth, of their people being free again. They were willing to shed their own blood and others to cause this to happen. This group becomes very, very important in Jewish life in the 60s AD, where one of their members is pronounced by a leading rabbi of that time to perhaps be the actual Messiah, Simon Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. And long story short, the Zealots gain in force, and they actually start a rebellion against Rome that is successful. And they expel the Romans from their land, and they establish an independent Jewish kingdom in AD 67, CE 67, and it lasts for 3 years. Unfortunately, Rome is not the kind of empire that's going to take that thing lying down. So in order to make sure other border provinces like Israel don't get the bright idea that let's just rebel against Rome, Israel did it. Rome marches everything it has right at Jerusalem, and there's a tremendous slaughter. The Jews are stripped of their homeland. The temple is completely destroyed in AD 70. And what few Jewish defenders are left alive are holed up in the fortress of Masada, which Herod the Great built. After several months of an intense siege, the Roman Empire and their forces, their legions, are poised to take over and to ascend the siege ramps and take over the next morning. But as Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, tells us, the defenders of Masada, who were these zealots, rather than be defeated by a pagan army or to have to live in Roman servitude, choose to take their own lives in a mass suicide. So unfortunately, the Zealot movement, while it's really important in understanding the first century and in understanding why Judaism changes so much within 1 century, really led to some pretty tragic results. These folks are sort of in their early stages at the time of Jesus, but even one of the disciples is called Simon the Zealot, and we will encounter him as we look through the text. So it may be that even this guy was involved in a similar movement, that he was willing to do violence, to sort of be a thug for the cause of Israel, and leaves that movement for Jesus. What's kind of interesting is you'll see Jesus bringing a lot of different groups of people together: Sadducees, Pharisees. Some of those folks really like him. Some of them really hate him. You have a zealot, and you also have a tax collector. You'll see that phrase used a lot in the New Testament, and you probably have your own feelings about paying taxes and looking at that chunk that comes out of your check every time. You probably never send your IRS guy a thank you card. In the first century, in this particular Roman Empire part of the world, it was even worse because a tax collector was sort of like a local Benedict Arnold. It was somebody who had sold you out to the Romans and was extorting you for money on their behalf. They weren't paid a salary, so they collected the required tax that you had to pay, and they could require you to pay more. And these folks were willing to milk their own countrymen to amass a great fortune. And typically, they were scorned in Jewish religious and public life. So they were sort of viewed as being notorious sinners and people who were just bad that you didn't want to deal with. And these people respond pretty heavily to Jesus and to John the Baptist. And Jesus is criticized for having table fellowship, for being a close friend, or being accessible to these people and treating them like they have worth in a shame and honor culture. He says, so what? These are dignified human beings. I'm going to talk to them. I care about them just as much as any other. But when you see tax collector used, it's not just like this is a guy who's taking your money. It's not just an IRS agent. Understand that it's somebody who has politically betrayed their country and their countrymen to work for an empire that is imposing its will on them by force. So that's another group that's pretty important that you're going to hear about quite a bit in the New Testament stories. John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. We have to be careful when we talk about Baptists because we don't want to be like John from First Baptist Church down the street. But John the Baptizer is a religious reformer. He's a prophet. So he's somebody who is directly inspired by God, who is speaking to them messages on God's behalf. He plays a really important role in all four gospel accounts who understand him to be the forerunner of Jesus, is the last of the great Jewish and Hebrew prophets preparing the way for the Messiah to come, getting people's hearts ready to encounter God in the Messiah. And he is notable because he is a prophet who is evangelizing people who already believe. John's hallmark was baptism. So if you're not familiar with baptism, this is a practice where folks will stand in a pool of water and a religious official like a pastor or someone like that will dunk you underwater, and typically there's a pronouncement of burial and resurrection. And that is really the symbolism that's there, that your old life or yourself, some part of you, your sin, is being washed away and you're being raised to a newness of life or to a different identity. That was practiced in the first century in relationship to Jewish missionary activity, and that did happen. A lot of people were attracted to Judaism and they were interested in this ethical God and this unusual religion, and it was attractive to them and they would explore it. And some of them became believers to an extent. Somebody who believed in Yahweh and accepted him and was studying the word and beginning that we call that was not ethnically a Jew and hadn't fully converted through circumcision, which is the surgical removal of the foreskin on the penis for a male. And that's the way that you show your physical inclusion into the covenant family, and through these baptismal rites. Somebody who hadn't gone all that far and hadn't agreed to take on the whole yoke of the Old Testament law, but truly did have a personal faith or a belief that Yahweh really was God, and they wanted to study and learn more about that. We call that a God-fearer, and there are lots of those. What John was doing was a little different than the baptism that these folks were undergoing. If somebody was a God-fearer and they wanted to become a full member of the community of Israel, they would go through a baptismal process and the ritual symbolizes they're washing away whatever they were formerly, that's being buried, and they're being reborn as a child of the covenant and a full member of the Israel community. So that's the symbolism that it was normally used. It's somebody outside coming in to the faith community and coming into the Jewish family and under Yahweh's covenant. John does something really different with that. He goes to people who would have been popularly understood as being already in with God, people who were born Jews, people who had practiced that their whole life, and saying, it's not just enough to ethnically have this inclusion in the covenant. It has to be a personal choice. John is a preacher of repentance. The Greek word for that is metanoia. It can mean changing of the mind, changing of the heart, a radical reorientation of direction. John is calling for a personal faith response, and that is later evidenced by works, by a change of lifestyle, a change of character, a change in the way one carries themselves and carries out their life. So he is baptizing people who are already believers to show that they're moving into a deeper and more sincere commitment. They're moving into repentance because they want to truly be close to God and not just be that in a functional or perfunctory sense or cultural sense. They want to have a personal connection. And Jesus will really kind of pick up on that. In all the gospel accounts, Jesus goes to John and inaugurates his own ministry by being baptized by John. And in Mark's gospel, he actually preaches the very same words that John is quoted as saying. So, what Jesus is going to do is understood as an extension and an expansion upon John's work. And the reason it's characterized that way is Jesus isn't just like an anomaly, some brand new thing. He's the culmination of what all of the prophets and scriptures up to this point have been doing. And the New Testament authors really want us to understand him and what he's doing in that way. So that tells us a little bit about John the Baptist and God-fearers who are Gentiles. That's a word for non-Jew, who have come to a faith in Yahweh, but they haven't fully decided to convert and take on an obedience. They haven't agreed to take on obedience to all of the Old Testament commandments yet. That'll help you out when you run into those things in the text. There is a group that is important in the study of biblical studies and New Testament studies in particular that doesn't actually appear in the text. And we would call these folks the Essenes. They looked at what was going on in Jerusalem. They looked at the corruption in the temple. They looked at the way Rome was controlling things. And they were dissatisfied with the Pharisees, and they were dissatisfied with the Sadducees and the entire political system. So they said, you know what? This whole thing sucks. Let's get out of town. And they do. And they set up a community in Qumran, which is really in a pretty bleak desert area on the coast of the Dead Sea. It's on the shore of the Dead Sea. Um, and this is a sort of like a monastic community. They're celibate, so there's not a lot of loving going on there. It's a mostly male community, if not exclusively so. And they're awaiting the coming of the teacher of light. From what we know about them that we've found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are copies of their documents, and also our oldest manuscript for the Hebrew Scriptures or Old Testament, which comes from right around the time of Jesus in the first century, which curiously enough is about a 95% match to what we have in front of us today. So the Jews have done a really good job for a long time at passing on their scriptures and doing that with a very accurate process. The reason that we talk about these folks is we know that there are Jewish groups who were just so frustrated with so much of what was going on that they kind of checked out and formed an alternative community. And this group shares some ideology with Christians and with followers of John the Baptist, in that they were expecting a Messiah figure who they refer to as the teacher of light. They would think of themselves as the sons of light, whereas the people of this age who were not in relationship with God were children of the dark. So this is a pretty radical group, and they're looking to live out their faith in community, but they're expecting specifically a great act of deliverance, a messianic figure to come from God.